I watched Sheriff Karen slam the demolition notice against my cabin door as her deputy smirked behind her. 72 hours. That was all the time she was giving me to tear down the home I had spent 10 years building with my own hands. The cabin that passed every inspection. The cabin that had every permit. The cabin that sat on land I owned free and clear. "But Sheriff, what violations are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. She just smiled that cold smile and walked away. That was when I realized this was not about building codes at all. 10 years ago, I bought 5 acres of pristine mountain land 2 hours outside the city. It was everything I had dreamed of since childhood. Rolling hills covered in pine trees, a small creek that sang through the property, and absolute silence except for the wind and the birds. I was not wealthy, but I had saved every penny from my construction job for 15 years. This land was going to be my sanctuary, my escape from the noise and stress of city life, a place where I could finally breathe. Building the cabin took me 3 years of weekends and vacation days. I did most of the work myself, calling in favors from friends who knew plumbing and electrical. Every board I hammered, every nail I drove, every window I installed was done with love and care. This was not just a building. This was my dream taking shape. I followed every rule. I pulled every permit. I called the county inspector at every stage of construction. When the foundation was poured, he came out and approved it. When the framing was done, he signed off. Electrical, plumbing, roofing, final inspection. Every single step was documented and approved. The neighbors welcomed me with open arms. Mrs. Peterson brought me homemade apple pie when I moved in. Tom and Linda from the next ridge over invited me to their barbecues. The local hardware store owner, Bill, would special order anything I needed and never charged me delivery fees. This was the kind of community I had always wanted to be part of. For 7 peaceful years, my cabin was my refuge. I would drive up every Friday evening after work, and the stress would melt away as soon as I turned onto the gravel road. Saturday mornings meant coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Sunday afternoons were for reading in my favorite chair by the window, listening to the creek babble outside. Then Sheriff Karen arrived in our county. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon in September, wearing her crisp uniform and mirrored sunglasses, even though the sun was behind clouds. 2 deputies flanked her like she was expecting trouble. "Routine inspection," she announced, not bothering to ask permission before stepping onto my porch. "We have received complaints about unpermitted structures in this area." I invited her in, confused but cooperative. I had nothing to hide. My permits were framed on the kitchen wall, every single one of them. I showed her the inspection records, the building plans, the survey maps that proved my property lines. She walked through my cabin like she was looking for evidence of a crime. She opened closets, checked under sinks, even went up into the small loft where I kept seasonal decorations. Her deputies followed behind her, writing notes on clipboards. "This place seems extensive," she said finally, running her finger along my bookshelf like she was checking for dust. "Lot of additions and modifications from the original plans." "No, ma'am," I replied politely. "Everything was built exactly according to the approved plans. The county inspector can verify that." Karen removed her sunglasses and stared at me with cold blue eyes. "County inspectors can be overlooked sometimes. Mistakes happen. Corners get cut." The way she said it made my stomach clench. There was something in her tone that suggested she was not here to ensure safety or compliance. She was here to find problems, whether they existed or not. 3 days later, Karen returned. This time she brought a different deputy and a man in a county vehicle who stayed in the truck. She marched up to my door like she was serving a warrant. "I have some bad news for you," she announced, producing a thick manila envelope from her patrol car. "After our inspection, we have determined that your structure poses significant safety violations and must be demolished." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the official-looking papers, trying to process what she was saying. "Demolished? Sheriff, what violations? I showed you all my permits. Everything was inspected and approved." Karen's smile was thin and satisfied. Permits can expire. Codes change. What was acceptable 10 years ago might not meet current standards. She handed me the envelope with theatrical formality. "You have 72 hours to begin demolition. After that, the county will demolish the structure and bill you for the costs." My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. The demolition order was filled with vague language about structural deficiencies and code violations, but gave no specific details about what was actually wrong. "Sheriff, this does not make sense. What exactly needs to be fixed? Can I bring the cabin up to current codes instead of tearing it down?" "The violations are too extensive for renovation," she replied curtly. "Demolition is the only option." "Can I see the inspection report that lists these violations?" Karen's jaw tightened slightly. "That information is part of an ongoing county review. You will receive copies of all relevant documents through proper channels." "What proper channels? When?" "When the county determines it is appropriate." I felt panic rising in my chest. This could not be happening. "Sheriff, please, this cabin is my home. I have followed every rule, paid every fee, passed every inspection. Can you at least tell me what I did wrong so I can understand?" For a moment, something flickered across Karen's face. Not sympathy, but something else. Satisfaction, maybe, like she was enjoying this. "Sometimes people build things they should not build in places they should not build them," she said slowly. "Sometimes those people need to learn that rules exist for everyone, not just the people they think are beneath them." Her words made no sense. I had never claimed to be above any rules. I had never treated anyone like they were beneath me. I was just a construction worker who saved up to build a cabin in the mountains. "I do not understand what you mean, Sheriff." "You will figure it out." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me. 72 hours. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." As her patrol car disappeared down my gravel driveway, I stood holding the demolition order and trying to understand what had just happened. The papers felt surreal in my hands, like props from a bad movie. I called the county building department immediately. The clerk told me that no new violations had been filed against my property. She suggested I come in during business hours to review my file. I called the original inspector who had approved my cabin. He was retired now, but he remembered my property clearly. "That was one of the cleanest builds I ever inspected," he told me over the phone. "You did everything by the book and then some. I would stake my reputation on that cabin meeting every code requirement." I called 3 different contractors to ask about current building codes. None of them could think of any changes in the past 10 years that would require demolishing an already approved structure. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and stared at the demolition order. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate. The creek continued its eternal song. My cabin stood solid and safe around me, every board and beam placed with care and love. Nothing had changed about my cabin. The only thing that had changed was Sheriff Karen. I could not sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and began researching Sheriff Karen. If she was going to destroy my life, I needed to understand why. What I found chilled me to the bone. Karen had been elected sheriff 18 months ago, running on a platform of cleaning up the county and bringing order to rural areas. She had defeated the previous sheriff, a well-liked man named Bob Williams who had served for 20 years with hardly any complaints. But it was the complaints against Karen that caught my attention. Buried in local newspaper archives and county meeting minutes, I found a pattern that made my stomach sick. The Miller family had been forced to close their roadside produce stand after Karen cited them for unpermitted commercial activity on their own land. They had been selling vegetables from their garden for 15 years without any problems. Jim Harrison had his classic car collection declared a public nuisance and was forced to sell or remove 30 vintage automobiles he had been restoring on his own property. Neighbors said Karen personally drove by his place multiple times a week, measuring distances and taking photographs. The Thompson family was served with noise violations for their children playing in their own backyard during daylight hours. When they protested, Karen threatened to call Child Protective Services. Most disturbing of all was what happened to Elena Rodriguez. Elena had converted her garage into a small woodworking shop where she made custom furniture. Karen raided her property with 4 deputies, claiming she was running an illegal business. Elena's tools were confiscated as evidence, and she was hit with thousands of dollars in fines that forced her to close her shop permanently. Every single case had the same pattern. Rural property owners living quietly on their own land, suddenly targeted by Karen for violations that had never been problems before. And in every case, the property owners eventually gave up and either moved away or submitted completely to Karen's authority. I drove into town the next morning and started talking to people. At the diner, the hardware store, the gas station. Once people realized I was asking about Karen, they got nervous, but a few were willing to talk quietly. "She is on a power trip," whispered Martha at the diner. "Acts like she is the queen of the county and we are all her subjects." Bill from the hardware store was more direct. "That woman has a problem with anyone who does not bow down to her. You cross her once, she will make your life hell." "Why does no one stop her?" I asked. Bill shrugged sadly. "Who are you going to complain to? She is the sheriff. County commissioners are afraid of her. State officials do not care about rural complaints, and anyone who speaks up becomes her next target." That afternoon, I drove out to see Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor who had welcomed me with apple pie years ago. She was in her 70s now, a widow who had lived on her mountain property for 40 years. "Oh, honey," she said when I told her about Karen's demolition order, "I was hoping she would leave you alone." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Peterson glanced around nervously, even though we were alone on her porch. "Karen has been asking questions about you for months, driving by your place, taking pictures, asking neighbors about your visitors and your activities." "Why would she do that?" "Because you built something beautiful on your own terms, and she cannot stand that. Karen believes that everyone in this county should ask her permission before they breathe." Mrs. Peterson leaned closer and lowered her voice. "There are rumors that she has friends in development, people who want to buy up mountain properties cheap and turn them into expensive resorts, properties like yours." The pieces started falling into place. This was not about building codes or safety violations. This was about power and possibly money. Karen was systematically harassing independent property owners, making their lives so miserable that they would sell cheap and leave. But I was not going to be another victim who gave up and walked away. The next morning, I started building my case. If Karen wanted to play games with official paperwork and legal threats, I would learn to play that game better than she did. First, I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of every document related to my property. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Susan, seemed sympathetic when I explained my situation. "You are not the first person to ask for these records lately," she said quietly as she gathered my files. "Sheriff Karen has been requesting a lot of property documents recently. Can you tell me which properties?" Susan glanced around the empty office. "I probably should not, but she has pulled files on about 20 mountain properties in the past 6 months, all independently owned, all with cabins or homes built by the owners themselves." She printed out my complete file, going back to when I first purchased the land. Every permit application, every inspection report, every approval letter. The paperwork told the story of a textbook legal construction project with absolutely no violations or problems. Next, I contacted a lawyer in the state capitol who specialized in civil rights and government misconduct. Sarah Martinez listened to my story over the phone and agreed to review my case. "What you are describing sounds like selective enforcement and abuse of authority," she told me. "The problem is proving it. We need to document everything and establish a pattern of harassment. I think there are other victims. Then we need to find them and get their stories on record." That evening, I started making phone calls. I tracked down the Miller family, Jim Harrison, the Thompsons, and Alina Rodriguez. One by one, I told them about my situation and asked if they would be willing to share their experiences. The response was better than I had hoped. Everyone was angry, everyone felt powerless, and everyone wanted to see Karen stopped. "I lost my business because of that woman," Alina told me during a long phone conversation. 15 years of building my reputation as a woodworker, gone overnight because she decided I was a threat to her authority. "Would you be willing to document what happened for a lawyer?" "Absolutely. I have been waiting for someone to stand up to her." Jim Harrison was even more direct. "I have been collecting classic cars for 30 years. Never had a single complaint until Karen showed up. She destroyed my hobby and cost me thousands of dollars in forced sales. If you have found a way to fight back, count me in." Within a week, I had statements from 8 different property owners who had been targeted by Karen. The pattern was undeniable. Rural residents living quietly on their own land, suddenly hit with vague violations and impossible demands, forced to choose between fighting an expensive legal battle or giving up and moving away. But we also discovered something else. In 3 cases, properties that Karen had forced owners to sell had been purchased within months by Mountain Vista Development Corporation. A quick internet search revealed that Mountain Vista was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. The corruption was not just about power, it was about money. Sarah Martinez was excited when I called her with this information. "Now we have something concrete. Selective enforcement to benefit family members is serious federal civil rights violation. We can take this to the FBI if necessary." What do we do first? Document everything. Record all interactions with Karen and her deputies. File formal complaints with the county and state. Build an airtight case before she realizes what is happening. In my cabin. Keep fighting the demolition order through proper channels while we build the larger case. Do not give her any excuse to claim you are not cooperating with legal processes. That night, I sat on my porch and looked out at my peaceful mountain sanctuary. For the first time since Karen had appeared at my door, I felt hope instead of fear. I was not going to face this alone anymore. Sarah Martinez drove up to my cabin on a Saturday morning, bringing 2 assistants and boxes of legal documents. We set up a command center on my kitchen table and began building the case that would take down Sheriff Karen. The key is to let Karen keep digging her own hole, Sarah explained as she organized witness statements. Everything she does from now on will be documented and used against her. We want her to escalate her harassment because that gives us stronger evidence of civil rights violations. We filed formal complaints with the county commissioners, the state attorney general's office, and the federal civil rights division. Each complaint included detailed timelines, witness statements, and documentation of Karen's pattern of selective enforcement. But we also set a trap. Sarah had brought recording equipment and tiny cameras that could be hidden around my property. If Karen comes back to harass you, we will have video evidence of everything she says and does, she explained as we installed the devices. Is this legal? Completely. You have the right to record what happens on your own property, especially when dealing with public officials. The recording equipment was incredibly sophisticated. Cameras no bigger than buttons could be hidden in my porch posts and window frames. Audio recorders could pick up conversations from 50 feet away. Motion sensors would activate everything automatically. Now we wait for Karen to make her next move, Sarah said, and when she does, we will be ready. I did not have to wait long. 3 days later, Karen returned with 4 deputies and a man I did not recognize carrying a clipboard and a camera. They did not bother knocking this time. Karen simply announced through a bullhorn that they were conducting an official inspection, and I needed to exit the premises immediately. I stepped onto my porch, knowing that every word and action was being recorded. "Good morning, Sheriff. Can I ask what this inspection is for?" "Final safety assessment before demolition," Karen replied curtly. "You have had your 72 hours. Demolition begins tomorrow morning." "Sheriff, I have filed appeals with the county and state regarding your demolition order. Those appeals are still pending." Karen's face darkened. "Appeals do not stop county safety orders. This structure is dangerous and must be removed." "Can you show me the specific safety hazards you are concerned about?" "I do not have to show you anything. This is an official county action." The man with the clipboard stepped forward. "I am Jerry Morrison from Morrison Demolition. We will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow to begin tearing down this structure. You need to remove all personal property before then." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice calm and respectful. "Mr. Morrison, have you reviewed the engineering reports and building permits for this structure?" "I do not need to review anything. The sheriff has given me the work order." "But do you not have liability concerns about demolishing a legally permitted structure without proper documentation of safety violations?" Morrison glanced nervously at Karen. "The sheriff says it is condemned. That is all I need to know." Sarah had coached me on exactly what to say next. "Sheriff, for the record, I am requesting to see the engineering report that identifies specific structural deficiencies requiring demolition." "You are not entitled to see county internal documents. Under state public records law, I have the right to request copies of any documents used to make decisions affecting my property." Karen stepped closer to me, her face flushed with anger. "You think you are smart, do you not? You think you can lawyer your way out of this?" "I am simply trying to understand what code violations require demolishing my home." "Your home?" Karen laughed harshly. "This is not your home. This is an illegal structure on county land and you are trespassing." My blood ran cold. Sheriff, I own this land. I have the deed and survey documents. Property ownership can be challenged when structures are built illegally. The county has the right to reclaim land that has been used inappropriately. This was completely insane. Karen was now claiming that my legally purchased, legally surveyed, legally deeded property somehow belonged to the county. She was either making things up as she went along, or her corruption was even deeper than we had suspected. Sheriff, are you claiming that the county is seizing my private property? I am saying that people who build illegal structures on questionable land sometimes find out that their ownership is not as clear as they thought. Even her deputies looked uncomfortable with this conversation. One of them, a young man I had never seen before, was staring at Karen like he could not believe what he was hearing. "Ma'am," the deputy said quietly, "I thought this was just a building code violation." Karen whirled on him. "Officer Davis, return to your vehicle and wait for further instructions." "Yes, ma'am, but I just wanted to clarify the legal basis for." "Officer Davis, you will return to your vehicle now or find yourself on suspension." As the deputies retreated to their cars, Karen turned back to me with pure hatred in her eyes. "Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., this illegal structure comes down. If you interfere, you will be arrested for obstruction of justice." After they left, I called Sarah immediately. "Did you get all of that?" "Every word. Karen just committed several serious crimes on camera. She threatened to seize your private property without due process. She intimidated a subordinate officer, and she made false claims about your land ownership." "What happens now?" "Now we spring the trap." The demolition crew never showed up the next morning. At 9 a.m., I called Jerry Morrison's office and spoke to his secretary. "Mr. Morrison will not be proceeding with the demolition," she informed me. "He received some legal documents yesterday that raised questions about the work order." Sarah had moved quickly. She had served Morrison with a notice that he could be held personally liable for destroying legally permitted structures without proper documentation. Faced with potential lawsuits, Morrison had decided the job was not worth the risk. But Karen was not done with me. At 10 a.m., she arrived at my cabin with 6 deputies and a tow truck. This time she did not get out of her vehicle. Instead, she used the patrol car's PA system to make an announcement. "This property is now under county investigation for multiple violations. All vehicles must be removed from the premises immediately." I walked out to her patrol car. "Sheriff, what violations are you referring to?" "Your truck is parked on county right-of-way without proper permits." I looked at my pickup truck, parked in my own driveway at least 50 feet from the county road. "Sheriff, my truck is parked on my private property." Property lines are in dispute. Until that dispute is resolved, no vehicles can be parked in the disputed area. This was getting more insane by the hour. Karen was now claiming that my driveway was somehow county property, even though it was clearly within my surveyed boundaries. I would like to see the survey documents that show county ownership of my driveway. Those documents are part of an ongoing investigation. "Sheriff, you cannot tow my truck from my own property without a warrant or court order." Karen got out of her patrol car and walked over to me. Her face was red with anger, and I could see that she was starting to lose control. "I can do whatever I want," she hissed quietly, just loud enough for the hidden microphones to pick up. "I am the sheriff of this county, and you are nothing. You are a nobody who thinks he can challenge me. I am just trying to understand the legal basis for your actions." Legal basis, Karen laughed bitterly. I am the legal basis. What I say goes in this county, and what I say is that you do not belong here. One of her deputies, the same young Officer Davis from the day before, approached us cautiously. Sheriff, I have been reviewing the property records, and it appears that. Officer Davis, I told you yesterday not to question my orders. Yes, ma'am, but the deed clearly shows that this property is privately owned, and I do not see any court orders authorizing us to. Karen exploded. Officer Davis, you are officially suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. Turn in your badge and weapon immediately. The young deputy stared at her in shock. Ma'am, I was just trying to make sure we follow proper procedures. You were trying to undermine my authority, and I will not tolerate that from any officer under my command. As Officer Davis reluctantly handed over his badge, the other deputies exchanged worried glances. It was clear that Karen's behavior was making even her own people uncomfortable. But Karen was not finished escalating. She grabbed her radio and called for backup. This is Sheriff Anderson. I need additional units at 1247 Mountain Ridge Road for a possible domestic disturbance. Dispatch to Sheriff Anderson. What is the nature of the disturbance? Property owner is being belligerent and potentially dangerous. Request 3 additional units. I could not believe what I was hearing. Karen was fabricating an emergency to justify bringing more officers to my property. She was creating false reasons to escalate the situation. When the additional deputies arrived, Karen briefed them loud enough for me to hear. Subject has been increasingly hostile and uncooperative. He may be armed and dangerous. Approach with caution. This was character assassination on an official police radio frequency. Every word she spoke was being recorded by dispatch and could be heard by other law enforcement agencies in the county. One of the newly arrived deputies approached me. Sir, I am going to need you to step away from your vehicle and keep your hands visible. Officer, I am standing peacefully on my own property. I have not made any threats or aggressive moves. Just comply with our instructions, sir. As I raised my hands and stepped back, Karen smiled with satisfaction. She was creating a scene that would allow her to arrest me for resisting or interfering with her fabricated investigation. But she had made a crucial mistake. Everything she had done in the past hour was being recorded in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. Her threats, her lies, her intimidation of Officer Davis, her false radio calls, all of it was documented evidence that would destroy her career. And she was about to make an even bigger mistake. Officers, place this man under arrest for obstruction of justice and threatening a police officer. What threat did I make, Sheriff? You know what you said, Karen replied, but her voice wavered slightly. She was making accusations she could not support, and her own deputies were starting to realize it. That was when Officer Davis, standing by his patrol car with his badge and weapon surrendered, pulled out his cell phone and started recording. Karen noticed immediately. Officer Davis, you are not authorized to make recordings during an official investigation. Ma'am, I am no longer a county officer, thanks to you. As a private citizen, I have the right to record police activity in public. Karen's face went white with rage. She had suspended the one officer who might have supported her, and now he was documenting her misconduct as a civilian witness. The trap was closing around her, and she was the one who had walked into it. The arrest never happened. As Karen stood there fabricating charges against me, her radio crackled with an urgent message. Sheriff Anderson, this is County Administrator Williams. Return to headquarters immediately for an emergency meeting. Karen's confident demeanor cracked for just a moment. Dispatch, tell Administrator Williams I am conducting an active investigation. Sheriff, the administrator says this is not a request. You are to return to headquarters immediately and bring all officers with you. The other deputies looked relieved. Whatever was happening at headquarters gave them an excuse to escape this increasingly uncomfortable situation. As the patrol cars pulled away from my property, I called Sarah Martinez. They just left. Did you make this happen? The video from yesterday triggered some very fast action, Sarah explained. We sent copies to the county administrator, the state attorney general, and the FBI Civil Rights Division. When Karen threatened to seize your private property without due process, she crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The next morning, I drove into town to see what was happening at the courthouse. The parking lot was full of official vehicles I did not recognize, state police, FBI, and cars with government license plates. Susan from the clerk's office spotted me in the hallway. You should know that Sheriff Anderson has been suspended pending investigation, she whispered. State officials took over her office this morning and seized all her files. What about the demolition order against my cabin? Voided immediately. Turns out she had no legal authority to issue it in the first place. That afternoon, Sarah called with more good news. The FBI is opening a full investigation into Karen's activities. They want to interview you and all the other victims as witnesses. What will happen to her? If the evidence holds up, she is looking at federal civil rights violations, abuse of authority, conspiracy, and possibly corruption charges related to her brother-in-law's development company. Over the following weeks, the story unfolded like a house of cards collapsing. The FBI investigation revealed that Karen had been systematically targeting rural property owners as part of a scheme to force land sales to Mountain Vista Development. Her brother-in-law had been buying the properties at below-market prices, then reselling them to out-of-state developers for massive profits. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. Karen had falsified inspection reports, destroyed legitimate permits, and intimidated county employees who tried to question her actions. She had turned the sheriff's office into her personal enforcement arm for a criminal enterprise. Officer Davis, the young deputy Karen had suspended, became a key witness. He had been documenting Karen's illegal orders for months, hoping someone would eventually listen to his concerns. She was operating like a dictator, he told FBI investigators. Any officer who questioned her methods was threatened with suspension or termination. We all knew something was wrong, but she controlled our jobs and our families' livelihoods. The county commissioners held an emergency meeting and formally terminated Karen's contract. They also voted to review every enforcement action she had taken during her time in office. Elena Rodriguez was the first victim to file a civil lawsuit. Within days, 7 more lawsuits were filed by property owners Karen had harassed. The county's insurance company began settling claims quickly to avoid going to trial. Mountain Vista Development Corporation was raided by federal agents. Karen's brother-in-law was arrested on charges of conspiracy and wire fraud. The company's assets were frozen pending investigation. But the most satisfying moment came when I received an official letter from the county building department. It was a formal apology for the harassment I had endured, along with a certificate stating that my cabin was in full compliance with all applicable building codes and safety standards. The letter was signed by Bob Williams, the former sheriff who had been brought back as interim sheriff, while the county searched for Karen's replacement. "Your property is a model of proper construction and permitting," Bob wrote in a personal note attached to the letter. Karen Anderson's actions were criminal and had nothing to do with legitimate law enforcement or building safety. 6 months later, I sat on my porch with my morning coffee and watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold, just like I had done for years before Karen Anderson tried to destroy my life. But everything was different now, in the best possible way. The criminal trial had ended 3 weeks ago. Karen was convicted on 12 federal charges including civil rights violations, conspiracy, abuse of authority, and extortion. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay restitution to all her victims. Her brother-in-law received 6 years for his role in the land fraud scheme. Mountain Vista Development Corporation was dissolved, and its assets were distributed to the property owners who had been forced to sell below market value. But the legal victory was only part of the story. The real victory was what happened to our mountain community. Officer Davis was hired as the new sheriff after winning a special election by the largest margin in county history. His first official act was to create a citizen oversight committee to prevent future abuse of authority. Elena Rodriguez reopened her woodworking shop with equipment purchased using her settlement money. She had a 6-month waiting list for custom furniture orders and was training 2 apprentices. The Miller family expanded their produce stand into a full farmers market that drew visitors from 3 counties. They named their best-selling apple pie Sweet Justice in honor of Karen's downfall. Jim Harrison's classic car collection became a weekend tourist attraction. He charged $5 for tour and donated all proceeds to a legal aid fund for rural property owners facing government harassment. My own life had changed in ways I never expected. The story of my fight against Sheriff Karen had been covered by newspapers across the state, and I received hundreds of letters from people who had faced similar harassment from corrupt officials. Sarah Martinez suggested that I consider running for county commissioner to help prevent future corruption. The idea terrified me at first, but Mrs. Peterson convinced me to consider it. "You already proved you can stand up to bullies," she told me. "Now you can help make sure other people do not have to face what you faced." The civil lawsuits were still ongoing, but early settlements had already provided enough money to establish a legal defense fund for rural property owners. We called it the Mountain Justice Foundation, and it provided free legal assistance to anyone facing harassment by government officials. But beyond the money and the legal victories, something more important had happened. Our community had learned that corrupt authority figures could be defeated if people worked together and refused to be intimidated. The annual Mountain Community Picnic became a celebration of that victory. Families who had been living in fear of Sheriff Karen now gathered openly to share food, music, and stories. Children played in the creek while their parents planned community improvement projects. Officer Davis always attended the picnic in civilian clothes, bringing his guitar and leading sing-alongs around the evening campfire. "I want people to see that law enforcement can be part of the community, not separate from it," he explained. Last month, a documentary film crew came to interview me about the Karen Anderson case. They were making a movie about small-town corruption and wanted to understand how ordinary citizens could fight back against abuse of power. "What advice would you give to someone facing a similar situation?" the interviewer asked. "Document everything," I replied. "Find other victims and work together. Most importantly, never give up just because someone has a badge and thinks they can intimidate you. Authority without accountability is just bullying with official paperwork. The documentary would air next year, and we hoped it would inspire other communities to stand up against corrupt officials. But the most meaningful change was personal. My cabin had been transformed from a simple retreat into a symbol of resistance against government overreach. People drove up the mountain just to see the place where Sheriff Karen's reign of terror had finally been stopped. I installed a small plaque by my front door that read, "Built with permits, defended with courage, preserved with justice." Visitors often asked to take pictures with it. On quiet evenings, I still sat on my porch with coffee and listened to the creek sing its eternal song. The mountains were as beautiful as ever, and the silence was still perfect. But now that silence felt like victory instead of just peace.